All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack the massive cultural phenomenon surrounding Erik Larson's historical bestseller, The Devil in the White City. Now, if you run in circles that love architecture, U.S. history, or especially true crime, you have absolutely heard of this book. I mean, it sits on countless shelves and is constantly referenced as the ultimate definitive guide to one of America's most infamous figures. But what if the massive cultural reputation of this widely celebrated book is actually masking a totally different reality? What if the experience of actually sitting down and reading it completely shatters your expectations? Today, we're going to break down a really fascinating critical review that exposes the stark contrast between what readers think this book is about and what is literally hiding between its covers.
So let me ask you this. Is the definitive true crime book you've heard so much about actually hiding a surprising, completely mundane secret? Think about it. When you pick up a book with the word devil right there in the title, a book heavily marketed to the true crime community as the ultimate story of a historic serial killer, you expect thrills, right? Chills, psychological terror, a deep dive into a dark criminal underworld. But imagine the immense disappointment of cracking open those pages, getting strapped in for a dark thrill ride, and realizing that a massive portion of what you're actually reading is focused on, well, construction delays, architectural planning, and endless struggles with building logistics. It totally changes the experience. To understand how we get this profound disconnect, we really have to look at the timeline of events this book actually covers. It all basically starts with a tale of two entirely different Chicagos happening at the exact same time. The timeline kicks off not in Chicago, but over in France in 1889. The French had just hosted this spectacular World Fair and presented the magnificent Eiffel Tower to the globe. In response, the Americans decided to be, well, very American about it. They wanted to prove to the world that they could do one better. So the main storyline focuses on 1891, when America plans the first Great Chicago World's Fair. We follow Daniel Burnham, the main architect, tasked with leading this incredibly complicated construction, which, as the source notes, was definitely not smooth sailing. But right next to that timeline, in the exact same city, in the exact same year, a shadow falls. A man named H. Holmes begins a notorious crime spree, wreaking absolute havoc on the city, while everyone else is busy looking at blueprints. To really grasp the reader's expectation here, we have to look at the dark, captivating lore surrounding H. Holmes. If you are into true crime, you know this name. He wasn't just any killer. He's known as one of America's most prolific and notorious serial killers. The legend paints him as this ultimate charming monster. Unlike some others who were rough or chaotic, Holmes was allegedly handsome, attentive, and incredibly calculating. He used unbelievably elaborate methods for his murders. And before that, he was a prolific scammer and an insurance fraudster, realizing along the way that he actually enjoyed the killing part of his frauds. The lore around this guy is so intense that some people even claim he was secretly Jack the Ripper. Now, the reviewer we're pulling from points out that the Jack the Ripper theory doesn't really make much sense, but it just goes to show how immense the mythology around this guy really is.
Because of all that dark lore, readers flock to this book expecting a psychological deep dive into a psychopath. You want the author to ask the tough questions, right? You want to look into his childhood. You expect an exploration of the classic nature versus nurture debate. Like, was he born this way or was he made? Readers really want to know how a psychopath operating without a single shred of compassion actually saw the world. When you have a figure who starts out just stealing money and then evolves into someone who kills for life insurance and genuinely enjoys it, you naturally assume a 400-page book featuring him is going to unpack that psychology and connect the dots of his twisted mind.
In this is where the central twist of our source material hits you. It is the absolute ultimate contrast between what you expect and what you actually get. You go in expecting this coherent, gripping true crime narrative that unravels the mind of a monster. Instead, what you largely get is a history lesson about bad weather, frustrated contractors, and endless construction delays in 19th century Chicago. The expectation of a dark, thrilling underworld is met with the reality of reading about civic engineering. Let's actually look at exactly how the book divides its time to see why readers end up feeling so thrown off.
When you break down the actual focus of the book, it is a complete shock to true crime fans. The World's Fair construction, the planning, and Daniel Burnham take up a whopping 67% of the book, and H. Holmes? He takes up barely a third. And we aren't just talking about the physical space or the number of pages he's mentioned on here. The reviewer notes that it becomes clear very early on that Holmes was probably never supposed to be in this book in the first place. His inclusion feels incredibly disjointed, almost like an afterthought compared to the overwhelming amount of space dedicated to the fair.
Which brings us to a really harsh but highly revealing quote from the review. The reviewer states that Holmes was, quote, shoved into forcefully and ungracefully.
Why? Well, because Holmes actually had absolutely zero connection to the fair's architect, Daniel Burnham. They literally never met. It's never even implied that Holmes came to Chicago specifically for the fair, or that the fair somehow changed his existing sinister plans. He just took advantage of the heavy traffic heading toward the city to steal money and murder people. I mean, he did visit the fair, sure, but so did millions of other people. The reviewer speculates, and strongly agrees with the theory, that the author Erik Larson originally just wanted to write a book purely about the World's Fair, but publishers likely pressured him to shoehorn Holmes into the manuscript to make it more commercially interesting and appealing to the true crime crowd. And that forceful shoving, it really shows in the writing.
Because of this awkward integration, you get these glaring narrative discontinuities that prove the true crime storyline completely lacked care or coherent editing. In the parts about Holmes, we barely get a coherent storyline at all. There are so many missing parts that make it impossible for the reader to connect the dots. The reviewer points out a perfectly absurd example of this. In one bit of the book, Holmes is asking his wife to come with them somewhere. Then, literally in the very next section, he explicitly states that he's a single man. It's just disjointed. There's zero effort put into the parts of the book concerning him, making his entire presence feel completely lackluster.
But honestly, the disjointed editing isn't even the worst part. The reviewer makes a deeply poignant observation here. As much as we might hate the modern tendency to romanticize serial killers, this book's sloppy handling of the true crime element does a terrible disservice to Holmes' victims. By treating the killer as a tacked-on afterthought, the victims are written about completely offhand. The author doesn't take the time to properly explore their lives, ask questions about motives, or do justice to the unique tragedies of what actually happened. They're just glossed over so we can get back to the architectural history.
But what about that other side of the book, the architectural plot? Because while the true crime part is severely lacking, the author clearly poured all of his soul into the World's Fair sections. You can really feel the passion, the pride of the people's work, the hopefulness, and the absolute fear when things go wrong. However, the reality of reading it is kind of another story. The reviewer found this main plot incredibly boring and repetitive. The author tries to bring it to life using quotes from diaries and letters, but it remains really dry. You're reading endless repetitive complaints about the bad weather. You read over and over about people being fired, the exhausting search for replacements, and the constant panic that they won't manage to build everything on time. So even with the author's obvious passion for the subject, it just reads like a deeply repetitive history lesson.
No, wait, it isn't all bad weather and building permits. To lighten the mood a bit, the reviewer does acknowledge one genuinely fun and redeeming aspect of these historical sections. There are some fantastic cameos of famous faces visiting the fair before they were truly famous. You get to see historical glimpses of people like Helen Keller, the legendary architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and even Walt Disney's father. These little historical Easter eggs provide a really nice break from the dry logistics of the construction, adding a bit of much-needed flavor and excitement to the otherwise dense historical narrative.
So, it all comes down to a simple, binary verdict. How do you know if this book is actually for you? Well, you should absolutely read it if you like the deep, behind-the-scenes history of the Chicago World's Fair and the real nitty-gritty details of architectural planning. If that is your jam, you will really appreciate the author's loyalty to the actual events. But you should entirely skip this book if you want a coherent true crime story or if you're looking to understand H.H. Holmes's psychology. If you go in looking for the definitive serial killer thriller, you are going to be immensely disappointed by the lack of depth and the structural mess of his storyline.
Which leaves us with a truly provocative final thought from our reviewer today. Think about the booming true crime industry we have right now. There are so many informative shows and media out there about H.H. Holmes that proudly cite The Devil in the White City as their primary definitive source. But if we've just learned that this book is basically 67% architecture, completely lacks a coherent true crime storyline, features glaring narrative errors about the killer, and fails to explore his psychology or his victims properly, how much can we actually trust the media that relies on it? It really makes you skeptical about how true crime history is sourced and packaged for our entertainment, doesn't it? It's a fascinating question to leave you with, and definitely something to think about the next time you hit play on a true crime deep dive.